There are times, fellow seekers, when I ponder if I might be insane. My previous film review was A Study in Caution, a film hardly anyone saw, by a director who alienates even his most ardent followers, and whose heart is not so much an open book as a scattered mass of torn-out, mud-stained pages. I could pick the film apart as I pleased, with little fear that I might inadvertently rile his core support. So why, for my second film review, have I decided to dissect and analyze a movie that many, including myself, consider the best ever made, but many others consider a moldering pile of sterile pseudo-art? A film with a bookshelf's worth of criticism, positive and negative, by people far more informed than me. Simple. It is a film that has shaped me and my worldview probably more than any other, and in the wake of its 50th anniversary, I felt obligated to reach out to the many who dismiss it and offer my opinion as to its value. I do understand why many find it inscrutable, even paradoxical. It is an ode to the world-expanding power of technology, and yet has that technology ultimately turn against us? It has been idolized as one of the most profoundly spiritual experiences in all of cinema, so much that it was included in the Vatican's list of approved films, and yet draws much of its inspiration from a man who famously cried, "God is dead." It is an optimistic vision of the potential of humanity, and yet its most human character is a psychotic machine. On top of that, its director is universally lauded as one of the greatest to ever wield a megaphone, and yet also one of the most inscrutable and least understood figures in modern popular culture. So reclusive that someone was able to successfully impersonate him for years, even to film journalists, and so mysterious that many people genuinely believe he faked the moon landing. If you want to imagine how I'm feeling right now, think of a small child walking between two sleeping lions while holding a balloon, with a vulture perched on top of it. Still, I chose this path, and I must walk it. Naturally, this examination will contain massive spoilers for anyone who has not watched 2001. But if you haven't, and I can't say this more emphatically, stop this video and do it. It is often said that the influence of a work of art is incalculable, but in the case of 2001, that is literally true. Beyond the dozens of films and filmmakers for whom it served as an inspiration over the last 5 decades, how many computer scientists, astronautical engineers, special effects designers, or NASA scientists owe their careers to having seen it? Beyond, of course, those who have openly acknowledged it. Its commitment to realism has meant that its visuals still hold up to this day, and its design aesthetic would go on to define the look of science fiction for years afterwards. While its titular date may have passed, its prediction of the future, informed with the aid of NASA engineers and industry insiders, has stood the test of time, and may be finally coming to fruition now. It created one of the most memorable, frightening, and yet strangely sympathetic villains in cinema history, and its famously oblique ending, a near-silent 22-minute coda in which the film's sole surviving character enters into what appears to be a higher dimensional reality in which time, space, and ultimately human frailty itself are transcended, is considered by many to be one of the most intense metaphysical depictions ever set to film. As the baby boomers who famously watched the film on acid matured into Hollywood's establishment, they would attempt to compose their own variations on 2001's themes and questions. Now, with the Gen Xers slowly replacing their parents, we appear to be in the midst of another wave of 2000 wannabes. The American Film Institute currently lists 2001 as the 22nd best American film of all time, while the British Film Institute names it as the 6th best film ever made. But even as the film's stature has grown, a counter-argument has persisted since its release, that it is, as Pauline Kael famously put it, trash masquerading as art. This can be most obviously seen on IMDb's top 250 page, on which the voting public have consigned it to number 91, floating stagnantly in the chart's mid-water column, far below two of its more egregious imitators, Star Wars and Interstellar, and waiting for the next wave of Pixar films to push it out of the top 100. A running theme in the criticisms is the film's pace, which, to be fair, is not so much glacial as tectonic, and turned off just as many reviewers in 1968 as it does in our Instagram-addled age. Pretentious is a word detractors often use, but it is important to understand what that word actually means. Pretension is the state of having aimed for profundity and missed. But the problem with profundity is that everyone's depths are different. For a work of art to resonate with an audience on a deep level, it must first tumble through a maze of prior experiences, cultural associations, learning and instinct, before finally coming to rest at that special point of resonance. For those whose depths, for whatever reason, 2001 failed to reach, I am not here to explain why you just don't get it, man. You don't get a film like 2001. It gets you. All I can do, in my limited way, is shine a light down a different path, in the hopes that next time it will reach the center of your maze. And with that tortured metaphor out of the way, on with the show. In the early 1960s, a newly established filmmaker named Stanley Kubrick stumbled across a report by the U.S. military-affiliated think tank, the RAND Corporation. Likely drawing on conclusions reached by Enrico Fermi and others at Los Alamos, the report concluded that, as Kubrick put it, quote, "The universe was full of intelligent civilizations and advanced entities, by virtue of the simple fact that, as intelligence had existed on our world for such a short period, given the age of the universe, there would have to be worlds on which intelligence had existed for far longer." Kubrick was captivated. A lifelong fan of science fiction, he found the idea that humanity might someday come into contact with an alien intelligence too mind-shattering to dismiss. And as it grew in his mind, it formed the kernel of a project to create what he called, quote, "the proverbial, really good science fiction movie." In this, he was arguably too harsh. Several really good science fiction films had been released before 2001, some of which would influence it. Many more would follow afterwards, often influenced by it. But to this day, for me at least, 2001 remains the only great one. By 1963, Stanley Kubrick was a hot property in Hollywood. His previous three films, Spartacus, a sword and sandals epic, Lolita, a controversial black comedy about a child molester, and Dr. Strangelove, a controversial black comedy about nuclear war, were simultaneously critically acclaimed and financially successful. Strangelove had received 4 Oscar nominations and won 2 British Academy Awards. This meant that Kubrick had earned that which directors crave above love and money: clout. He had arrived on the set of Spartacus a week into production, after the previous director, Anthony Mann, fell out with the film's star and producer, Kirk Douglas. Douglas had starred in Kubrick's previous film, Paths of Glory, and brought Kubrick on as a hired hand, a position he loathed. A photographer before he became a filmmaker, Kubrick was used to having absolute control of every frame of every shot, and he and the cinematographer clashed venomously over his demands that each take be reshot from every angle. Never work for hire, never sign on to someone else's project, and above all, never relinquish control. For the rest of his career, he would adhere to that rule like a barnacle to a rock. His first step in regaining control was to move out of Hollywood, which he did, relocating to England in 1961, and remaining there, bar a few location shoots, for the rest of his life. His second step was to have his contract stipulate that he have absolute and total control over every aspect of the films he made. In short, Kubrick was in the ideal situation to create his good science fiction movie. He had the power to secure a substantial budget, which provided awesome visuals, and the freedom to shape the story as he desired, which allowed him to explore ideas that had often been sidelined or left to subtext in the more commercial sci-fi of the past. In 1964, Kubrick excitedly informed Roger Karras, his production company's vice president, that he was reading, quote, everything and everybody in sci-fi and futurism in preparation for his next project. Karras said he should drop them all and just read Arthur C. Clarke. Karras eventually recommended that Kubrick and Clarke collaborate on the project together. Like all the best science fiction writers of his era, Clarke was far more than a science fiction writer. He was a futurist who wrote journal articles on the cutting edge of astronautics. He was an inventor who first conceived the possibility that geostationary satellites could be used for telecommunications. And he was, in later life, a public figure and television personality, though, unlike his fellow luminary of science fiction's golden age, Isaac Asimov, he was never a scientist. In March 1964, Kubrick wrote a letter to Clarke outlining the major themes of what would become 2001: A Space Odyssey. 1. The reason for believing in the existence of intelligent extraterrestrial life. 2. The impact, and perhaps even lack of impact in some quarters, such discovery would have on Earth in the near future. 3. A space probe with a landing and exploration of the Moon and Mars. On April 22, 1964, Clarke and Kubrick met over cocktails at Trader Vic's, a tiki-themed restaurant, to hash out concepts and, according to Clarke, discuss Gregor Cantor's theory of trans-finite number sets, leading Clarke to declare Kubrick a latent mathematical genius. Clarke agreed to sell 6 stories to Kubrick to see if any could provide inspiration. Kubrick sold them all back, but germs of the ideas from these works would creep into the final product regardless. One of the stories, Expedition to Earth, featured an alien who arrives on Earth 100,000 years ago and is treated as a god by primitive humans. Another, Breaking Strain, was about a 2-man space crew on a mission to Venus who must make drastic choices to survive after their ship is incapacitated by a meteor. But it was an entirely different story that would prove the film's most fertile source: The Sentinel, a short story that Clarke had written in 1948 as a failed entry for a BBC competition. Often erroneously called the story on which 2001 was based, The Sentinel instead could best be described as the acorn to 2001's oak. Like most of Clarke's stories, it is relatively straightforward. An explorer on the moon decides to disembark from his palatial moon buggy and do some low-gravity mountaineering, only to come across a strange crystalline pyramid, seemingly impervious to the passage of time, which he sends to Earth. Unable to determine its function, humanity does what it does best and destroys it, quote, with the savage might of nuclear power. The narrator then concludes that whoever placed the object on the moon must have intended it as a kind of marker to determine when we had reached sufficient level of technological development to find it, and that our destroying it may have silenced its transmission and thus alerted its creators to our presence. The ending leaves uneasily ambiguous what their response to our inadvertent hail will portend for our race, saying only, quote, we have set off the fire alarm and have nothing to do but wait. I do not think we will have to wait for long. As well as his stories, Clarke attempted to dissuade Kubrick of his opinion that no truly good science fiction films had yet been made, recommending a library of the best regarded of the genre from across the history of cinema, from Fantastic Voyage and Forbidden Planet to The Day the Earth Stood Still and the H.G. Wells scripted Things to Come. Of Things to Come, Kubrick offered this critique to Clark, quote, "What are you trying to do to me? I'll never see another movie you recommend." But it's still fairly clear that many of these films must have struck a chord. It's hard to look at the disciplinarian Martian Klaatu from The Day the Earth Stood Still, or the ancient, long-dead aliens of Forbidden Planet with their gargantuan dream-manifesting engine, and not see them reflected in the story of 2001. Kubrick, always a visually oriented filmmaker, considered film scripts, quote, "the most uncommunicative form of writing ever devised," and saw novels as far more imaginatively freeing. And so, to let their imaginations soar, he and Clark decided that, while Kubrick was composing the script, Clark could write a novel that would be neither source material nor an adaptation, but a separate project drawn from the same ideas and informed by the changes undergone by the film over its production. Clark and Kubrick formally agreed to a partnership on the 17th of May, 1964. As if to augur the future, that night they both observed a UFO on Kubrick's penthouse deck. Sadly, it was not an alien craft. Rather fittingly, it turned out to be Echo 1, an early NASA experiment in satellite telecommunications. This joint enterprise would be the meeting of two great intellects, but also two arguably greater, if justified, egos. And yet, there was very little creative tension reported between them. Clark's friends, among whom his ego was legendary, often said that Kubrick was the only person he ever took a back seat to. To ease into the writing process, Clark sealed himself away in the Chelsea Hotel in New York, a perennial haunt for creative types made famous by Leonard Cohen and Andy Warhol. On the occasions when Clark attended the hotel bar, he would often find himself in conversation with William Burroughs or Allen Ginsberg, which might explain some things. In December 1964, Clark and Kubrick submitted the first script treatment under the provisional title Journey Beyond the Stars to MGM, who agreed to fund the film at an initial budget of $6 million, about $50 million in today's money. For comparison, grand blockbusters of the time, like Ben-Hur or Lawrence of Arabia, were usually budgeted around $15 million. The studio's press release for Journey Beyond the Stars focused almost entirely on Kubrick himself and his artistic achievements, indicating that MGM viewed the film as a prestige picture rather than a blockbuster. They conceived the film as a roadshow release, a limited release in a few high-priced exclusive venues, in which it could be screened in all its glory, followed by a rollout to the budget houses. The film was to be screened in Cinerama format, an early precursor to IMAX, which was a boon for MGM, as that format was still lucrative. They also hoped to tap into the excitement of the ongoing space race, which had only begun 3 years before with Gagarin and Shepard. Some at the studio conceived the film as a kind of virtual space race. The Soviets might be able to outspend the US government, but they could never outspend Hollywood. In February of 1965, Clark and Kubrick had decided on the final title of 2001: A Space Odyssey, believing that the year was far off enough to seem exotic, but not so far as to seem fantastical. I'm not sure MGM truly understood what they'd gotten themselves into. 2001: A Space Odyssey would be in production for over 3 years, 2 in post-production, which would see its budget double. And in all that time, no MGM executive was allowed on the set. It's fair to say that wouldn't happen now. Contrary to popular myth, 2001 was not initially a financial flop. In fact, it was profitable long before the hippie generation saved it. It's true that at its premiere, a fifth of the audience, or roughly 200 people, walked out before it ended. Rock Hudson famously stormed out demanding to know what the movie was about. Kubrick subsequently cut 17 minutes from the runtime, which have never been screened since, although they do still exist. It is also true that prominent critics savaged it upon its release, mostly those in New York, but the majority of critics praised it. Certainly by 1972, the BFI Sight and Sound poll, the decadal survey of international cinematic critical opinion, saw fit to place 2001 in its top 25 films of all time. The film certainly did get a second win when, in a marketing coup, MGM decided to advertise its psychedelic ending as, quote, the ultimate trip, reportedly resulting in members of the acid generation running down the aisle screaming, "It's God! It's God!" But it wasn't necessary. By the end of its extended run, 2001 had made $8 million in profit on its $12 million budget. Not gross, profit. So what were those bored New York critics and raving teenagers watching? What is 2001 about? Well, it is about many things, but in terms of plot, it's actually fairly simple. Believe it or not, 2001 is not a particularly long film. The final theatrical cut runs 141 minutes, making it 1 minute longer than Wonder Woman and 13 minutes shorter than Transformers: The Last Knight. Surprisingly little, however, actually happens in it. It is divided into 3 titled sections. Some argue incorrectly that it is in 4 parts, but I shall return to that later. In a sense, you could say it has a 3-act structure, though not a traditional one. The first section, called The Dawn of Man, opens in the harsh, barren landscape of the Olduvai, the cradle of mankind, as a group of Australopithecines struggle for survival against the onslaught of predators, the environment, and each other. They are no less a part of nature than the tapirs they casually forage beside. Then, one day, the apes notice something strange. A seemingly artificial structure, artificial to us, of course, not to them, a perfectly black, perfectly flat slab that appears to be emitting some kind of dissonant choir. Actually, the atonal piece Requiem by Hungarian composer György Ligeti. They approach it in an apparent state of wonder, even worship, touching it as if attempting to groom a superior. The next day, the alpha male, called Moon Watcher in the script and novel, has a moment. To the thunderous chords of Richard Strauss's prelude to Also sprach Zarathustra, he picks up a bone and uses it to smash a skeleton, as his mind whirls about the possibilities the new power has opened up. He smashes a skull, first the skeletons, then a tapirs, and then a rival apes. In a state of warrior ecstasy, he throws this first tool into the air, and then, in the most famous match cut in cinematic history, the soaring bone becomes an orbiting satellite, millions of years crossed in the space between frames. While the film's introduction to the 21st century, set to Johann Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz, which arguably is now more associated with space than it is with a river, may at first appear to be a plotless FX montage, it is in fact telling a story. We see the terminally bored Dr. Heywood Floyd make his way on a Pan Am space plane, those were optimistic times, toward a rotating space station. Other than a single flight attendant and presumably the pilot, Floyd appears to be the only person on the plane. Once the plane docks, Floyd engages in mundane airport activities, getting through immigration, calling home, chatting to stewardesses, which marks, jarringly, the first spoken dialogue in the film, before being caught off guard by a group of superficially friendly Soviets. This is 1968's 2001, not ours, with whom he engages in an awkward verbal duel regarding the nature of his apparently top-secret mission. Cut to another long space journey, in which Floyd, once again alone on a vast ship, travels in the far larger, gawkier craft to Clavius Base on the Moon. Once there, he holds a very dry press conference, revealing the rationale for the secrecy. Something has been found on the Moon with the potential to psychologically devastate the human race. On a flying bus out to the site, we learn that whatever it was found because it was emitting a very powerful magnetic field, and appeared to have been deliberately buried 4 million years ago. Upon arrival, it is revealed to be a second monolith, which the team descend to examine, to the same eerie Ligeti music. Suddenly, the monolith sends out a massive radio pulse that overwhelms their speakers and sends them into paroxysms of pain. Here endeth Part 1. The second section is called Jupiter Mission 18 Months Later, and introduces us to the crew of Discovery 1, a spindly, vulnerable spacecraft apparently motionless against the night. The ship is in limbo. Most of its crew are asleep. Only 3 members of the crew are awake, nominal captain David Bowman, second in command Frank Poole, and a hyper-intelligent artificial intelligence named Hal, who oversees the quiet everyday of the ship through a series of unblinking red eyes. For reasons unknown, Hal malfunctions and mercilessly murders everyone except Bowman, whom he instead traps outside the ship. But Bowman outsmarts Hal and finds his way back, and in a twistedly touching final battle, slowly undoes Hal's higher brain functions as the computer regresses to childlike senility. Immediately upon Hal's death, a message from Floyd plays, revealing the existence of the monolith to the now dead crew, and, more crucially, that the radio pulse it emitted was aimed at Jupiter. To keep the ulterior motive for the Jupiter mission secret, only Hal had been made aware of it. Here endeth Part 2. Part 3 is called Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite. Given that he has little else to do at this point, Bowman decides to get into his little exploratory pod and commence the monolith investigation. Amid the rainbow dance of Jupiter and its moons, he sees a third monolith, identical to the other two, only miles across. The Ligeti music begins again, but instead of landing on the monolith, Bowman is transported to some form of higher reality, in which all the universe appears to blur before him at light speed. The soundtrack fills with a quaking rumble, as if time and space themselves are being torn apart. Bowman appears to rush through a raging tunnel, where energy explodes in wild patterns. As he tears through this higher dimension, he sees what appear to be alien landscapes, exploding stars, entire galaxies, and even life in formation. And then it stops. Bowman finds himself and his pod in a strangely ordinary room. It appears to be a hotel suite, but it has no doors and no windows. The floor is lit with the same soft light we saw in the briefing room. The soundtrack is filled with ghostly whispers, sounding vaguely like alien voices. Actually, another Ligeti piece called Nouvelle Aventure. We see David Bowman encounter increasingly older versions of himself, and then, in an instant, become them, as if he were suddenly uncoupled from our blinkered three-dimensional perception, and able to see the events of his life in their entirety, as we would a distant chain of mountains. The final Bowman, a crippled ancient figure, seemingly haunted by an unknown sadness, holds his arm upward as if pointing to God. Not God, but a final monolith, standing silently and incongruously in the moon. The theme from Also sprach Zarathustra plays again, and we see, above the bed, not a dead man, but an infant encased in a womb. As the chords of Zarathustra reach their climax, the enwombed child, now a gigantic godlike figure, stands over the earth. In judgment, in expectation, in fear, we never learn. And that is the end. So, you might well be asking, what the hell was that? Well, I'm afraid I can't give you a single, simple explanation. Indeed, to do so would be to undermine the film's ultimate purpose. Kubrick's films are notoriously difficult to read. There's an entire documentary recounting various alternate readings of The Shining, for God's sake. Kubrick was also legendarily fastidious, often asking his actors to endure dozens or even hundreds of takes of the same shot. So it is common knowledge that in a Kubrick film, every element of every frame is precisely, deliberately placed. Kubrick also loved to play around with paradoxes and to hint at alternate interpretations of his films. This leads many fairly established, moderately sane people to plunge into some pretty deep, dark wells when contemplating his work. One of the books I read made much hay of the fact that the numerical designation for the moon monolith, TMA-1, when spelled like this, is an anagram of no meat. Or it could just be because it was a magnetic anomaly found on the Tycho crater. I am not one to try and second-guess a man like Stanley Kubrick. He was a nationally renowned photographer at 17. I am a 42-year-old maker of YouTube videos. So in my analysis, I will do my best to merely dip my toes into the well, to restrict my speculations entirely to ideas that I know Kubrick and Clarke had mentioned themselves. Next time. This is a long video.